That's normal.
Some kind of supernova. Watch out, look at me go. 힘이 좀 boy. 빛의 core, so high. 문이 열려. 서로의 존재를 느껴. 마치 Discord. 날 닮은 너 누구야? Drop. 사건은 다가와. 에이, 거세게 가져가. 에이, that tick bomb. that tick bomb. 감히 건드리지 못할 걸. 누구도 말야.
I like how this
지금 내 안에
moving fast to different scenes back to back.
Can't stop, hyper, stellar. 멈춰, 그걸 찾아.
She's lifting up her car.
불러내 내 우주를 봐봐. Supernova. Body bang. Make it feel too right. 휩쓸린 energy so special. 잔인한 queen이며 scene 이제 종결. 이토록 거대한 내 안의 explosion. 난 모든 슈퍼갤로부터 만든 control. 지금 계속돼. 에이, 우린 어디서
I like how they just breaking stuff.
Supernova. Nova. Can't stop. Hyper. Stellar. 멈춰. 그걸 찾아. Bring the light of a dying star. 불러내 내 우주를 봐봐. Supernova. 보이지 않는 힘으로 내게 손 내밀어볼까. 가능한 모든 가능성 무한 속에 너를 만나서 봐줘. Bang bang. Don't forget my name. Supernova. 사건은 다가와.
Hey,
거세게 커져가.
I like that transition.
우린 어디서 왔나? 사건은 다가와. 거세게 커져가. Tell me. 우린 어디서 왔나? 우린 어디서 왔나? Nova. Can't stop. Hyper. Stellar. 멈춰. 그걸 찾아. Bring the light of a dying star. 불러내 내 우주를 봐봐. Supernova. 사건은 다가와. 거세게 커져가. 질문은 계속가. 우린 어디서 왔나? Bring the light of a dying star. Supernova.
Like the transitions in this was really good. Like it was just really like the transition is really good. This is my first time ever listening out here and watching the aespa song. So this is my first time reaction to this group. But like it's just I like the transitions in this video and like everything just really fast paced. You know, it's supernova. So we're gonna bring it back one more time. Since it's my first time hearing and reacting to this group, I want to listen to it and like watch the video again.
I'm like some kind of supernova. Watch out, look at me go. 힘이 좀 boy. 빛의 core, so high. 문이 열려. 서로의 존재를 느껴. 마치 Discord. 날 닮은 너 누구야? Drop. 사건은 다가와. 에이, 거세게 가져가. 에이, that tick bomb. that tick bomb. 감히 건드리지 못할 걸. 누구도 말야. 지금 내 안에선 supernova.
Su.
Can't stop. Hyper. Stellar. 멈춰. 그걸 찾아. Bring the light of a dying star. 불러내 내 우주를 봐봐. Supernova. Body bang. Make it feel too right. 휩쓸린 energy so special. 잔인한 queen.
The beat is really good also for this song.
이토록 거대한 내 안의 explosion. 난 모든 슈퍼갤로부터 만든 control. 지금 계속돼. 에이, 우린 어디서 왔나? 에이, 느껴 내 안에선. Supernova. Nova. Can't stop. Hyper. Stellar. 멈춰.
It's a bop. It's a bop.
Bring the light of a dying star 불러내 내 우주를 봐봐 Supernova 보이지 않는 힘으로 내게 손 내밀어볼까 가능한 모든 가능성 무한 속에 너를 만나 잡아줘 Bang bang don't forget my name
Transition.
Supernova 사건은 다가와 거세게 커져가 질문은 계속돼 우린 어디서 왔나 사건은 다가와 거세게 커져가 Tell me 우린 어디서 왔나 우린 어디서 왔나 Nova Can't stop Hyper Stellar 멈춰 그걸 찾아 Bring the light of a dying star 불러내 내 우주를 봐봐 Supernova 사건은 다가와 커져가 질문은 계속돼 우린 어디서 왔나 Bring the light of a dying star Supernova
Good song. Good song. Really like it. Like I said, first time me hearing aespa's song or reacting to the video, but I really like the song. Group seems pretty good, singing, choreographed, like the video's done really well. Like I wouldn't have a problem watching more. So if you'd like me to see more, if you have any more suggestions, leave in the comment section. aespa Supernova. This video. Hopefully I'm saying that right. aespa, right? aespa. Somebody let me know. Usually I get people in the comment section to let me know if I'm pronouncing like the names wrong or whatever. So if you're new, make sure you subscribe, like, comment below any video suggestions you have. Make sure you drop a like on the video so YouTube will let the world know that you guys like these videos, and they put me in the algorithm so more people can see these videos. So make sure you do all that, and I'll see you guys in the next reaction.